We have the option to build a future where we have shared prosperity for people born in low-income countries and high-income countries alike.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sagoe, and in this podcast, you will hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You just heard from Rebekah Smith, who's the Executive Director at Labour Mobility Partnerships, or LAP. LAP believes in the power of movement to address some of the biggest issues we all face in the global economy. Coming up, you'll hear about the benefits that migrant workers can bring to origin and receiving countries and to industries in the private sector. But first, let's hear from my colleague Carmen Pedraza from IHRB's Migrant Workers Programme. Carmen, this subject is often politicised, and it's been amazing to hear just how beneficial migrant workers are to both sending and receiving countries. How did you feel when you first started looking into this issue?
To be honest, I was amazed by the data. I, as part of IHRB that works with migrant workers, am aware of the need for their protection, but these figures are astounding when highlighting the urgency for everyone around the globe to understand the need for migrant workers.
I like that. I like what you said about highlighting the urgency. It is an urgent subject matter that's also topical. So LAMP uses a different term when it comes to referring to migrant workers, which we'll hear more about from Rebekah. But in the meantime, Carmen, can you tell me what LAMP does?
They basically state the economic case of the world. So they highlight how the global north needs migrant workers and how the global south can offer those migrant workers. And within this, let's say, narrative that they use to describe migrant workers as, a labor force that needs labor mobility to provide stability for everyone around the globe, they advocate for the creation of a responsible recruitment industry that will guarantee the protection of migrant workers and this stability for both the receiving and the sending country.
Sure. And, what you just said gets me to think about this whole idea of responsible recruitment, why it matters, which is a conversation that Rebekah is going to be participating at as a keynote speaker during the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. Can you tell me about that?
I'm particularly excited about seeing her there. She's going to be, as you mentioned, the keynote speaker, and she's going to talk more in depth about this economic case that, as I mentioned, LAMP exposes. She's going to explain exactly what is the need for the global north for migrant workers, like why is there a labor scarcity there, and then why and how does the global south can offer that, and also making sure that everyone needs to protect for the labor force and the migrant workers through this process.
Thank you for that, Carmen. And you will find out more about the Global Forum at the end of this episode. So earlier on, we mentioned that LAMP uses a different term rather than migrant workers, and that term is labour mobility. Let's hear from Rebekah about why she thinks that's important.
The reason we refer to it that way is when you talk about immigration, you're actually making several very complex decisions at once. Not just who works in our society, but who gets to live here, who are our future voters. Those questions are highly politicized and involve lots of questions of identity. And that politicization is something we can't currently afford, as we'll talk about later in today's podcast. But the act of a willing worker filling a needed job is one that should be much more simple, and in the coming world, increasingly necessary and critical to the health of our societies. So when we talk about labor mobility, we're trying to really focus in on the most essential relationship, that of the worker and the employer, and leave out some of the much more complex societal questions.
Okay, so you use that term to clean out the political noise around what labor mobility partnerships sees on migrant workers, like their actual value.
Right, exactly.
It makes perfect sense. why should labor mobility, why should the work of migrant workers be important for sending countries or the origin countries, receiving countries, and businesses? But because it's a broad question, we can start from the first one, which is why are migrant workers important for origin countries, for the ones who send them?
So starting at sending countries, origin countries, so low-income countries face a critical problem as we look into the coming century, which is not having enough jobs for the workers. Within 10 years, all population growth in the world will be in low-income countries. The number of workers is growing far faster than the number of jobs in these countries where underemployment and poverty are already defining features of life. So within Africa, already today, between 10 million and 12 million youth enter the labor force every year, and only 3 million jobs are created. So you're talking about 9 million African youth entering the job market every year that don't have hope of stable, productive employment. And it's only going to get worse from here as that population growth accelerates. So we need a pathway to stable and prosperous employment for those workers. And then when you look at the opportunity, when you consider not just domestic labor markets, but international labor markets as an opportunity for those workers to enter good jobs, then you also create the opportunity for them to increase their income by, on average, 10 to 15 times. And that salary increase from, the same worker doing exactly the same job abroad makes migration one of the most powerful anti-poverty tools in the world today. When you chart that increase in income to that worker against the benefit of foreign aid or what they could hope to receive from current development assistance, you can't even see the foreign aid on the charts. That's how powerful migration is. You can think about this in the context of your own life, right? What would you do to increase your income by 10 times, right? And for many of these workers, the answer is doing the exact same job they're doing today in a different country. And then that benefit doesn't just accrue to that worker, but to their families as well. So for sending countries, that comes home in the form of remittances. Remittances are the money that is transferred home by migrants to their families back in the origin country. And remittances have been referred to by many scholars as the world's largest anti-poverty program. They've been responsible for not just lifting families out of poverty, but actually you can see the impact of remittances on entire countries. So in Nepal, for example, Nepal was able to reduce its poverty headcount from 45% to 15% over a 20-year period, despite the fact that in that same 20-year period, Nepal itself experienced very low economic growth rates. So it was due in very large part directly because of the remittances coming home from migrant workers. That is important as well because that money flows directly into poor families. So it's in fact also far more direct of poverty alleviation and cash transfer than many other forms of aid or economic growth. It's going directly into the families who then are spending it on health, education, investments for their family. So it's a really direct anti-poverty tool. In fact, the Philippines, which is one of the most established origin countries in the world, hosts an annual welcome home ceremony at Christmas for workers returning home, greeting them as heroes for all of the money that they've sent back home throughout the year. So for the sending countries, it's a critical jobs program and it's a critical anti-poverty program.
It's not a surprise that they are celebrated. In Nepal, it decreased then by 30% the poverty levels. It's stunning. I have to say that I read something also that you wrote like in these comparisons which blew my mind because I myself am a Mexican and I didn't know and I couldn't believe that remittances were actually giving Mexico more income than oil because we are an oil country. And not only like top 50 oil country, we're amongst easily the top 15, top 12 country to produce, to have oil. And we earn more from remittances of migrant workers. That number blew my mind, I have to say.
Exactly. Well, you're pointing to something really important and quite special, really, which is that when we think about the resources of these countries, we think about oil, we think about what can they produce, we might think about coffee, right? But we don't think about their people. But in the coming century, people are increasingly important. So I think that thinking about it that way, thinking about your people as a really valuable asset, can change how we think about the growth strategies countries have.
So why are migrant workers, why is labor mobility important for a receiving country?
So I mentioned that people are going to be increasingly important and valuable in how we think about economies moving forward. And so that takes us to the high-income countries. And they have the exact opposite problem of what we talked about for low-income countries in the future. Low-income countries don't have enough jobs for their workers, and high-income countries don't have enough workers for their jobs. Business Insider just had an article come out last week talking about how America is entering a new era of forever labor shortages. But that's not just America, that's all high-income countries. So OECD countries are rapidly aging. We need, on average, an additional 15 million more workers a year beyond what we can project from current birth rates, just to keep our societies and our economies functioning. We're already seeing the early tremors of this, right? The dangerously understaffed hospitals leading to the nurses in New York going on strike because there weren't enough nurses to staff the hospitals appropriately. Think of the long lines at the airports. You can think about elderly people going without care, not being able to get care for children and elderly family members. Think about the inflation all over our economy, much of which is driven by labor shortages within supply chains. We're starting to feel these early tremors, but I think what a lot of us haven't internalized is that this is our future, that without action, nothing about that is going to change. Unfilled jobs are already costing the global economy $3 to $7 billion every day. And without action, as the aging of our society sets in, this is going to get far, far worse. And this has far-reaching repercussions beyond just jobs. So if you think about that ratio of working-age people to elderly people, that's not just about the jobs that are filled, that's about the structure of our social safety nets, our pension systems, etc. So this is fundamental to how comfortable all of our lives are going to be, to whether or not I and my kids, you and your kids, have pensions, is whether or not we have enough workers in the society to actually pay into the systems that are able to create a comfortable future for the elderly people in our society. So it's really fundamental to how all of our social systems are structured is how many workers you actually have in the economy. And right now, we're facing a very bleak future with far too few.
And such is the example of most developed economies.
Yeah, that's right. The easiest way to think about it is we've all been watching the experience of Japan, right? That famously has an aging society with far too few workers. And even Japan, though it's been historically closed to immigrants, is beginning to open its immigration policy because of precisely this problem. But the easiest way to conceptualize it is we are all Japan. They're just a decade or two ahead of us, but we're all in the exact same situation.
So we're taking a moment here to acknowledge how fascinating all of these statistics are, Carmen, because they are so at odds with what we often hear about migrant workers in the mainstream media. What really struck you from these figures?
There are plenty, but to be honest, I was pretty surprised about listening how in OECD countries will need or currently need 15 million more workers just to keep their economies working. It also surprised me to listen how, like, the cost of this, like, how much is it costing for the global economy? The fact that we have these unfilled jobs, which is up to $3 to $7 billion a day. That's absolutely stunning. I mean, also to listen that for migrant workers to work abroad, this represents an increase on average from 10 to 15% of their income. It just states the case of how it's a win-win situation for everyone.
Indeed, these numbers are really interesting and important to know because they help shift the narrative or perceptions around migrant workers. Coming up, you're going to hear about the impact that labor shortages are having on different sectors and the best way to address these issues given the major challenges that exist in current migration systems and where, as a migration community, we can help.
And now to our third stakeholder in this formula, in which there are developed economies that will need migrant workers and developing economies that have them. Where do we place businesses? Why is it important for businesses to understand this and the role of migrant workers?
Yeah. Well, businesses are right at the center, right? They're, in fact, the first ones to feel these pains because many of us might be feeling kind of the end effects of inflation or not being able to buy the things we want, not getting the care we want. But businesses feel it first, right? Because they're not able to hire the workers that they need to. And I think the most obvious implication is that many businesses, especially small and medium enterprises, won't be able to survive without getting these workers, right? We're seeing farms across America closing because they're not able to hire agriculture workers. There was a quote that absolutely blew my mind from the Dutch Minister of Social Care and Health that said that in the future, old people are going to have to rely more on themselves and less on professional caregivers because there simply won't be professional caregivers. And we're seeing that already in the US today. Many aged care centers are closing because they can't hire workers. So we're facing a future where many of the businesses that we rely on won't be able to operate because they can't get enough workers. So I think, they're at the heart of all of this, and I think they need to be at the front of our strategy and helping to identify and helping us and helping policymakers to understand what this future looks like without enough workers and what's going to happen to us as a society. So I think businesses are really kind of the front lines and can help us build a much more proactive strategy for how we design labor markets in the future that speak to these problems. And I think businesses have a really exciting and positive role here as well, because when we talked about the transformative effect that migration opportunities can have on people born in low-income countries and really on the growth strategy of low-income countries as a whole, businesses actually in some sense hold that opportunity, right? Because they're the ones who create the jobs. They're the ones who create the opportunity. So by extending their jobs to people born in low-income countries, businesses are actually acting as an agent of change, helping people move out of poverty. And in doing that at scale, in building a strategy for a different labor market where we answer these giant labor needs, we can actually also build a world where labor markets are working to the benefit of the most vulnerable. So businesses really have a very central role to play in all of this.
Can you mention maybe a couple of industries that will be directly or the most impacted if there's labor shortage, and also if they cannot offer the labor in the country where they stated? Like, how transversal is this?
Oh gosh, it's it's across most sectors, right? In some way or another. Care is the one that we mention a lot because it's very personal. You can really feel the impact. We've seen it during the pandemic, especially for women. It's really directly impacted women's labor force participation because if you can't get care for your elderly parents or for your children, then often the sacrifice that is made is that professional women don't get to work. And at the same time, care is the canary in the coal mine, right? Because it's hit from both ends. It's got more customers as societies age faster and fewer workers. So it's hit on both sides. So it's really at the very front of all of this. But there's so many other sectors that are affected. There's agriculture, there's transportation. We all saw the lorry shortages, and now across the US as well. There's shortages of truck drivers that are part of what's driving all of the shortages along supply chains. There's construction, there's hospitality and tourism, there's manufacturing. In fact, the current CHIPS Act in the US, where the Biden administration is attempting to bring back computer chip manufacturing to the United States. the success of that attempt is being threatened by the fact that there aren't enough workers, not just skilled workers to actually make the chips and do the engineering, etc., but to build the factories. There's not enough construction workers. So it's, at all levels of the supply chain, the shortage of workers is threatening not only the basic functioning of our society, but also some of these policy priority areas as well.
And now that you touch on policies, actually, so the global issue will be this labor shortage. And policymakers will have to do something about it to keep a balance of their economic. What other alternatives will there be out there that maybe other policymakers might be considering beyond labor mobility, or maybe because they're making the mistake of not considering migrant workers?
Yeah.
Like, what are the other options?
There aren't really other good options, to be honest. So if you think about what we're trying to preserve is that ratio of workers to elderly people, right? And that's what's already at an all-time historic high, but going to get much higher from here. And that same ratio, though it sounds quite dry, is what underpins our whole societal structure in terms of our pensions, our benefits, our taxes, everything. So if you think about the two elements there, working age people to elderly people, you have basically three options, right? The first thing you can do is you can have more babies. And we haven't really seen good policy results on that. Many countries have made attempts to increase fertility rates. We haven't seen great policy results, but certainly to the extent that people aren't having children they want to because they're not getting social support, we should be doing more of that. However, there's two problems there. The first is that even if you do that, you're likely only going to get roughly to around replacement rate. You're not going to actually increase the number of people in your society that way, because there's lots of evidence that as women become more educated, they just want fewer children as well. And it tends to settle around 2 on average, which is replacement rates. The second is, even if we did manage to significantly increase fertility, those babies aren't going to enter the workforce for 20 years. So we'd still have to answer the problem of the next 2 decades, right? So increasing fertility rates is worth effort, but also not something we currently have good proven solutions for. The second thing you can do is you can reduce retirement benefits. And if there is one thing that is more political than immigration, I think we can agree it's that. If you look at the experience of France in the last month, trying to increase the retirement age by only 2 years, that led to a whole shutdown of society for nearly a month, right? And had significant political backlash. And that's a really minor increase. Only 2 years isn't nearly enough to make up the gap. We would need to significantly reduce retirement benefits or raise the retirement age. So that's, just a political non-starter. Or you can bring in more migrants, right? Those are really the 3 levers you have. So we like to say that labor mobility is really the least impossible of these 3 impossible options. So of all of them, it's the one that's actually most likely to succeed and, has this powerful opportunity to transform our societies for the better. Outside of that, the option is basically societal collapse. So hopefully, if we don't go with labor mobility, hopefully at least pick one of the other 2.
If it's the obvious solutions for both developing economies and developed economies, then what are the main challenges when taking action towards effective labor mobility partnerships?
It's a great question. And the thing is that while labor mobility is the obvious solution, when you look at our demographic and economic future, at the same time, voters, politicians, businesses, and industries are all rightfully nervous to scale and invest more in migration. This nervousness is driven by problems in how migration currently happens. We see a lot of irregular migration, like the situation along the US southern border right now. You've got abuse and exploitation of the workers, recruitment fraud, overstay. So these actors are rightfully concerned about how migration is currently happening. And when you look at these problems, you might draw the conclusion, why would we do more of that, right? So it's understandable, but the good news is that these are all problems that have known solutions. So these problems are resulting from the design of our migration systems. They're not inherent to migration itself. There's also millions of potential work visas in Europe and Asia that are currently going unfilled because of poorly designed rules, unharnessed employer demand, and limited worker resources. And a big problem that's driving those unfilled visas is the missing industry of service providers helping to overcome those obstacles. So if you think about a highly educated worker moving across jobs, there's all sorts of industry support for them for every aspect of their life and relocation, right? They'll help you sell your mortgage, they book your flight for you, they give you someone to help you navigate, find the right neighborhood to move in, etc., right? And I've been to the conferences of the industry actors that are providing those services. But that support is completely missing for workers and employers trying to navigate migration systems in the trade and service sectors. And this drives a lot of the problems we see because they're trying to navigate opaque, bureaucratic, and frequently nonsensical systems. And that leads to a lot of the irregular migration, a lot of the recruitment fraud that's driven by the lack of transparency in the system. So here's what we can do. We can use the existing unfilled visas to incubate the missing industry, to incubate the solution. The training institutes, the financing products, the professionalized, responsible recruiters. And in doing that, we'll first de-risk the migration experience for employers and migrants who could be using those unfilled visas. And at the same time, we can be demonstrating how migration can work in a way that makes everyone more comfortable to openly support it. So the first thing we need to do is fix the way migration works today. Then, by demonstrating that it can work in a way that speaks to everyone's concerns, we can make them comfortable to open the policy space to actually truly do labor mobility on the scale that answers our needs as a society.
So migration doesn't work today because of the design of the migration systems, the bureaucracy around it.
That's right. There's a great paper I would point you to by Michael Clemens called Migration is What You Make It. And it goes through 7 different problems in migration and policy areas in migration and shows how the design of the system is actually what drives that problem. And what are the solutions we know for how to fix it?
Every business should read that book.
Absolutely. And every policymaker, on all of us, really.
Now that you're talking about, like the solutions are at hand, the assets are at hand, the human value is there, do you have maybe an example of any economy that showed us that they're already tackling this issue of redesigning or improving? It's not even reinventing the wheel, but it's just improving for the best of their own societies, these migration systems. Who can we look at?
As these changes set in, we're actually already seeing a number of countries take steps to welcome more migrants. So I mentioned that Japan is opening its doors in a historic reversal of its previous immigration policy. Germany has a goal of recruiting 400,000 workers per year. We see Canada setting historic migration targets. Australia is currently redoing its immigration strategy. So we're seeing a number of countries start to take steps, recognizing that migrant workers are essential to the future of our economies and our societies. Now, I think within each of these examples, we still see obstacles, we still see struggles. And I think that's where the community that is coming together at the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment, so the corporate leaders and employers, as well as the industry providers like recruiters and training institutes that I mentioned, have a key role in saying, all right, politicians are starting to do their part of opening up some of these policies and strategies to welcome more workers, but they need support from the private sector to make this work, right? So I think that's for us as a migration community, as people invested in this issue, to then start designing the practical solutions. And I think that's a lot of what's missing right now and has only been done in very small ways, is if you have the policy space, how do we make it work in practice? And I think the moment is now for us to start designing those solutions.
I like what you're saying about the fact that migration is not the issue, but rather the way we are understanding it because of the system that it's trapped in. I think the work that you're doing is admirable because you're pointing towards the obvious and practical solutions. And though I assume that some countries and governments are slowly moving towards them, but I don't want to be a pessimist about it. And I mean, it's good to know that there is some work being done out there and that business are included in it because, according to myself, but please correct me if I'm wrong, I think that businesses are the best actors when better applying the practical solutions.
That's right. We have the option to build a future where we have shared prosperity for people born in low-income countries and high-income countries alike, right? We have that opportunity right now to reshape labor markets in the way that they work to the benefit of the most vulnerable in the world. And businesses really hold one of the main keys to that. So I think this is the leadership of the business community can actually bring us to a much more prosperous, much more equitable world. So we tend to believe that optimism is the only choice, that we have to build the future we want. And so I think I look forward to building a partnership that gets us to that world.
That's a really inspiring thought there from Rebekah on what she hopes will be the future of labour mobility. Carmen, just to wrap up, what are the 3 takeaways you want everyone to understand and remember from this conversation?
I would start with the undeniable and with the quantitative value of the work of migrant workers for everyone. The second one has a lot to do with the very name of Rebekah's organization, Labor Mobility Partnerships, because it is important to change the narrative. Last but not least, I really like a concrete solution that Rebekah is stating, which is the construction of a responsible recruitment industry to achieve the prosperity and stability that the value of migrant workers represent.
Thanks for that. From what you've just said, we can infer some strong call to actions as well. So at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. Can you tell us a bit more about what will be discussed there?
This will be the perfect space for all stakeholders to come together and to discuss the solutions and to tackle the issues that are not allowing or are in the way of building this responsible recruitment industry that Rebekah has been talking about, or how much it's needed for the protection, yes, of migrant workers, but for the benefit of everyone. It will for sure be a unique space to discuss these key issues and to achieve concrete solutions.
Thank you, Carmen, for that great conversation. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And if you would like to find out more about the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment, then head to gfrr.org. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast. That way you'll never miss an episode. Bye for now.